We're going to learn about the prophetic personalities of Christ. You guys ever heard of that? No. Turns out there's people in the Old Testament that are described in the Old Testament that the Jews thought were going to be the coming Christ, which is just Greek for Messiah. So Jesus Christ, Jesus Messiah, the Hebrew word's Messiah, the Greek word's Christ. I actually missed that on an exam before I was in graduate school once. I was really disappointed in myself. Anyway, the point being that they thought about these people as prophetic personalities. So, like when they're questioning John the Baptist, they say, "Are you the prophet?" The prophet was a guy that Moses said was going to come after him who was just like him. So that's what they're asking John, if he's the prophet. Then they ask him if he's Elijah, because there's a prophecy that says Elijah has to come before the great and terrible day of the Lord and before Jesus comes. Which is, by the way, how we know the great and terrible day of the Lord already happened, because Elijah already came. So if you're reading passages that people say are great tribulation passages, that are going to come at the end of the world, and you say, well, this is the great and horrible, terrible day of the Lord, well, we know that already happened in the fall of Jerusalem because Elijah already came. So unless Elijah comes again, maybe it's me. I don't think so. Someone comes again in the spirit of Elijah, but we know John the Baptist was Elijah because Jesus said so. So if Jesus says that someone was something or did something, it's pretty much, he's God, so he's right. So the prophetic personalities that Jesus fulfilled are people that were in the Old Testament, and then it's prophesied that Jesus would be them. So let's look at them. So it's kind of like, who was Jesus according to what the Old Testament says? So the first one is the suffering servant. So turn to Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53 is the famous, infamous suffering servant passage in the Bible. Well, not to pick on you, but it's a really nasty passage, you know, when you think about how it describes it. But yeah, fine, that's great. It fulfills prophecy, and that's cool. All right, so there's how many verses?
17? No.
12. So read 2 verses and pass it on. Okay, this is not a passage the Jews thought was about the Messiah. The reason they didn't think it was about the Messiah was because they were more along the impression that the Messiah was going to be the Davidic King. He was going to rule, and he was going to reign, and he was going to destroy all their enemies. So they were looking for someone, according to Josephus, who wrote the Jewish Wars, who would rule and conquer the entire world on their behalf. And they weren't looking for someone that was going to suffer. This passage talks about suffering. So, and it says the guy's going to die. And if you're familiar a little bit with the Gospels, Jesus says that he's going to fall into the hands of evil men, they're going to kill him, and then he's going to rise on the 3rd day. And then what do the disciples do? They immediately have a discussion about what rising from the dead might mean. Because they don't have any idea what rising from the dead might mean, because it's not something that they thought of or laid their hand to. There's a couple of instances of people who were risen from the dead by prophets in the Old Testament, but by and large, they didn't have any concept of someone dying and then coming back, nor did they think that their Messiah was going to do that. So what Jesus does is he adopts all these different prophetic personalities that are in the Old Testament, and he puts them together into one person. But the Jews didn't even realize that these were going to be about the Messiah, because to them they seemed conflicted. So if Jesus is going to sit on the Davidic throne, he's going to be David's son, he's going to rule the world, how does he get oppressed? How does he die and not come back? It doesn't make any sense, right? If the guy's going to rule forever, thy throne, O God, is forever and ever. If that's going to be the case, then how's that going to astray? He's oppressed and afflicted. He didn't open his mouth. So Jesus, at his trial, he didn't open his mouth. He's like a lamb that's led to the slaughter. His grave was assigned with wicked men, so he died between 2 thieves, yet he was with a rich man in his death, it says in verse 9. So he was buried in a rich man's tomb. So that fulfills, so there's a prophecy about that. There was no deceit in his mouth. The Lord was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief. It says that he was cut off from the land of the living in verse 8. He was cut out of the land of the living. But then in verse 10 it says, he will see his offspring, he will prolong his days. Well, how can he prolong his days and see his offspring if he's dead in verse 8? But see, he rose from the dead, and his offspring is who? It's us. We're the firstborn he's the firstborn among many brethren, the New Testament says. So Jesus sees his offspring are spiritual. The result of anguish to his soul, he would be satisfied. Knowledge of the righteous one will justify the many. He justifies us through his suffering and death and resurrection. And then he'll have a portion with the great, divide the booty with the strong. Yet he himself bore the sin of many, interceded for the transgressors. So the Jewish people were not looking for someone who's going to die for the sins of the world. When they were looking for their Messiah, that isn't what they thought was going to happen. They didn't really understand what the Messiah was all about. Okay, so that's the first prophetic personality that Jesus fulfills. He said he claims to be, by claiming that he's going to die and rise again to his disciples in 3 days, he's claiming to be the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. And then he fulfills those passages. Okay, so the next thing is he's the pre-existent Son of Man. Jesus existed before he existed. So if you read in John 7, Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. They tell him, he says, Abraham saw my day, and he rejoiced, and he says, before Abraham was, I am. So they knew that he was claiming to be, he claimed the name of God, because when you go to Genesis and you see the progression of events, one of the things that happens in Genesis, right, is Moses goes to the burning bush, and then the burning bush, he talks to God, and God says, who shall I say sent me? When you're going to send me these people, who shall I say sent me? And he says, tell them, I am has sent you. And so when Jesus says that he, before Abraham was, I am, he's claiming the name of God. In Greek, it's ego eimi. He's claiming to be God. So they pick up the stones to stone him on the Temple Mount. Then what does he do? He hides himself. I don't know if he does the Jedi mind trick. I don't know exactly how he, these are not the droids you're looking for. I'm not exactly sure how he does it. If he just slips behind a really fat guy, I'm not sure exactly. But he hides himself. Okay, so let's look at the pre-existent Son of Man. Jesus existed before he existed. Daniel 7, 13 and 14. This is a vision that Daniel's having, and it has, and this is depicting Jesus before Jesus was born.
Daniel what?
Daniel 7, chapter 7, and then 13 and 14. So, what happens is this is the throne room of God. The Ancient of Days is God, okay? So it's probably capitalized in your Bible, the Ancient of Days. So this is what happens usually when people are introduced to God in the Old Testament. They freak. So I believe it's Isaiah at the beginning of the book of Isaiah. I'm not screwing this up. No, it's Isaiah. He's in the throne room of God. And in the year Isaiah died, I saw the Lord holy and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple with glory. So he's in God's temple, and he falls on his knees, and he says, behold, I am a man of unclean lips who comes from a people of unclean lips. The first thing that happens to you when you're in the presence of God is you're convicted of your sin, okay? So here's a prophetic personality. He walks into the throne room of God. He's presented to the Ancient of Days, but does he fall on his knees? Does he give obeisance? Does he bow? No. He's presented dominion. So the problem is that this guy doesn't seem like he's a regular man. He isn't praising God. He isn't worshiping God like the angels. He walks in and he gets dominion. Dominion meaning he rules, he reigns. He walks in and he receives a kingdom. Straight up, walks up to God, thank you very much, sits down. So it's a weird kind of spooky passage. Well, Jesus calls himself 80 times in the Gospels. He describes himself as the Son of Man. And when Stephen is stoned in Acts 7:56, he looks up to heaven and he says, behold, I see the heavens open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. So in a prophetic vision right before he dies, the first martyr in the New Testament, Stephen, sees Jesus, calls him the Son of Man, and he's standing at the right hand of God. So when Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, he's appealing to this passage in Daniel and claiming his pre-existence as a supernatural being who doesn't bow the knee to God. He just walks in and gets his dominion. So it's an incredibly powerful passage. But the Jews wouldn't have necessarily known this was about the Messiah either, because you just wouldn't have thought this was a regular guy. The next prophetic personality that Jesus claims is the Davidic King. By the Davidic King, I mean he claims the throne of David. So in order to fulfill prophecy, the Messiah has to be of the tribe and lineage of David. So we know, everybody knows the story, right? Jesus is born in Bethlehem. He has to be born in Bethlehem, and he has to be from David's line. both his father and his mother's adopted father and his mother were of the tribe and lineage of David. So by adoption, he's of the tribe and lineage of David through Joseph, and both lineages are listed in the New Testament.